Hi everyone, this is Chris, and I would like to begin my discussion today about Karl Marx with speaking about the direction that I approached Marx from. Um, I'm thankful for this opportunity to look at Marx in a historiographical way because I had always encountered Marx by way of the 20th century movements, socialism, communism, and kind of those manifestations of his ideas, and also the use and misuse of his name, Marxist, Marxism, socialist, that sort of thing. And it was nice to be able to look back at his original work and to see where he fit in context with other writers of history, Hegel and others in the German historical writing tradition. When you look at a world history textbook, you often see Marx mentioned at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Then he sort of disappears until he is brought back up again at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. And it was nice to be able to look at him in terms of the writers that influenced him and then his influence on later writers and how his writings and economic theories, how they originated and how they developed over the course of his life. And so in doing that, he becomes part of a literary tradition, and instead of being a historical figure, he becomes a writer of history, and then he increases our perception of the past. So to begin, I want to start with a little biographical data about Marx. He was born in 1818 in what is now Prussia to a Jewish family. He had rabbis on both sides of his family. His father will later convert to Christianity, though, to escape some anti-Jewish laws. He becomes acquainted with Friedrich Engels after receiving his doctorate in philosophy, and he moves to Paris. They will write the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and then by 1849 he's moved to London, where he'll spend the rest of his life and pass away in 1883. My literature review is going to begin with Leonard Krieger, and some of the commonalities that I see between Krieger, Gilderhus, and Brysick is that they all mention that Hegel influenced Marx, and Hegel influenced Marx, but also Marx will take Hegelian concepts and alter them to suit himself and to suit his material concept of history. Two of the ideas that Krieger mentions are alienation and the use of the dialectic method. And with alienation, you will see Marx originally use it in a political sense, but then later he will adopt an economic perception of that as well, which through his economic scope both fit into each other. The politics fits into that. Marx's dialectical approach will differ from Hegel's in that Marx viewed the impetus for all of human activity to be material. He looks at the material world for sources of reason. Hegel was interested in ideas combating each other to move history along. He is going to look at the thesis and antithesis. But Marx, he says that it's all rooted in reality. And so he's looking at modes of production, the physical world, the physical evolution of production, and conflict between classes to move history along. Gilderhus does the same thing. He mentions this source of conflict and how that dialectic is moving history along. Brysick does the same, but he words it slightly differently, and he mentions that Hegel had inspired Marx to create a grand scheme that is explanatory and that offers resolutions to history. So that wording there kind of changes how we view Hegel's influence on Marx. All of the secondary sources are going to mention historical materialism and that conflict between social classes and the fact that it moves history forward toward an ideal state of being. Furthermore, Marx is with that ideal state of being, Marx is providing a resolution to all of these conflicts and tensions that he's talking about between the different classes and between the influences of technology on the workplace. That there's a resolution to that, and to Marx that comes at the end of his grand scheme of history. Krieger and Gilderhus both mentioned that Marx had an interesting habit of the way he applied his thoughts to history. They both mentioned that he sort of manipulated manipulated history and to fit, manipulated history and reality to fit his theories. Krieger specifically mentions that he made assumptions about history and kind of threw them into the past as anchors, and then found within reality the manifestations of those assumptions. A lot of other scholars will disagree with Marx in that way, but he's creating a conversation about how society, politics, and economics all coalesce. Within Marx, there's also a large structure taking place. There's a creation of a structure that is also flexible, and all three to some degree mention this structure. He uses economics as his focus, but he acknowledges that economics is a part of a larger superstructure that includes all other aspects of human existence: religion, society, culture, those sorts of things. Brysick is interesting in that he provides an actual chart in his writing about Marx, so you can see how Marx's dialectic moves forward and how history is moving forward in eras, leading up to this utopian society at the end. You can see in Brysick's chart how technology is playing a role and how the interactions between the different social classes from their genesis all the way up to the creation of your modern proletariat and bourgeoisie, how those are moving history along as well. And you can see that in that chart probably most clearly. With regard to the primary sources, I started with the Communist Manifesto, and in the Communist Manifesto, Marx describes that path of labor, and he talks about, and you'll see this in Engels' works as well, Engels' text as well, how the introduction of machinery and the development of technology has altered man from his original existence, and how it's altered his true essence and his relationship not only to his labor and his products, but also to other human beings. And it's this tension that then plays a role in being an undercurrent through the rest of history, and it moves that system forward. Once again, that's relatable to Hegel's concept of the thesis and the antithesis, that conflict moving history forward. It's interesting in the later part of the Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels have divided a series of prefaces to different editions of the Communist Manifesto. And in doing so, if you look at the different prefaces, they provide historical examples. For example, when they were speaking to the Polish audience, they mentioned the Russian Empire, what role Poland plays in that. They mentioned geographical locations that would have been of relevance to the Polish people, and they mentioned revolutionary attempts such as in 1863. So he's using history to make his arguments relevant to the people and to show them that his arguments are legitimate and that they can clearly be seen in the past. And he does that for a German edition, an English edition, and of course a Polish tradition, and even an Italian one. So you can see those different examples, how Marx is using history to appeal to his audience. In Engels' Principles of Communism, he kind of structures this one in a question and answer format, which was helpful to see some of those basic tenets of communism. Once again, he points to technological improvements, the steam engine, etc., the development of the factory system. He's talking about that development of the labor process and production, the means of production. Interestingly, he mentions the proletariat in relation to serfs, slaves, manufacturing workers, guild workers, or handcraftsmen. And so in doing that, he's showing historical examples, but then by pointing out that there were still in his day serfs in Russia and early on slaves in the southern part of the United States, he shows that the path of each nation or group towards his ideas does not apply to an absolute timeline. And so that gives this overall structure flexibility, and that's a good example of that. In the later part of that work, Engels focuses on the ideal future society, and he mentions that human nature will have changed at that point because the impetus for their original nature, that will have changed as well. And the last one in Engels is Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. He points to a departure from Hegel's idealism by stating that the final cause of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, but in the changes of the modes of production and exchange. So once again, he's tying into that aspect of the material concept of history. He goes on in this one to explain a cycle where the advances in technology and production methods have created commodities, and then those commodities have then led to cycles of surplus and economic decline. And then even though that economy may rise up again, it's moving society towards an eventual revolution. And so he's building the case towards a takeover of the state of those means of production to resolve that cycle and that conflict. But then he points out that that's not the end goal, that there will be another state beyond that, a more utopian existence where all society will share in those means of production. Now, the three questions that I have for an analysis of Marx are that, number one, how does Marx and other historians rationalize the creation of political bodies by man? And so I think Marx is often viewed in terms of politics, and I would like to ask the question, what role does politics play in their ideology? And it's not just exclusive to Marx. Do they view politics and statehood as natural products of human desires, or are they artificial constructs? So are political states and political entities a natural evolution of man? Have they been created for a purpose by a particular class or by a particular group or for a particular reason? And then how does Marx's political interpretations compare with other historians' nationalistic, religious, maybe in the case of the Protestant historians, aims? So did they have political goals as well when they were talking about a nation's history? And then, of course, you could even tie that into today. Do historians have, how do they rationalize politics today? How do politics play into the history that they tell? And I think that's important because we seem to be in a very political age. We're very polarized in terms of our politics. But politics has played a role throughout history, and I think it's interesting to see how that may have been used by past writers and how they even viewed the creation of politics in general. The second question is, how does Marx's view of the progressivism of history compare to that of Christian historians? And we talked a lot about how Christians viewed history from the time of the fall of the Roman Empire up through the Protestantism that came later. And how is Marx's view of this progression of history, or his progression of history, similar to or different from this earlier Christian view of the progression of history? And although Marx saw religion as not having really any weight, and he definitely viewed it as part of the overall superstructure, but he also mentions that the superstructure was in the business of oppressing the proletariat, and it was used by the bourgeoisie for that purpose. Did he, in fact, adopt a structure for history that was based on something immaterial, which, according to him, would have been religion? And then finally, along with that, is there a place for religion in Marx's version of a new social order? So in this new utopian society, does religion play a role at all? And then for my final question, Marx and Engels, they spend a substantial amount of time making predictions about the future as a logical continuation of their structure that they have been talking about all along and using historical examples for. They're, of course, probably not the only ones that are doing this, that they're not the only historians or writers that are making predictions using history as a basis. But the question I have is, how have historians taken part in predicting the future throughout time? This could include predictions about individuals, nations, global and economic issues, legacies of both individuals and nations. And then a secondary question is it proper for historians to do this? And whenever I begin a new school year, I ask my students we have a discussion of why we study history, what's the purpose of it. And one of the most cited reasons that I get is so that we don't repeat the past. And if we're not, and we as historians, if we're not making predictions, then what role do we play, or do we play a role in moving society forward? And do the interpretive grids of historians help society to rationalize events in the present? And in doing so, does this aid them in making their decisions about the future? So just as a recap, the three questions are: number one, how does Marx and other historians rationalize the creation of political bodies by man? And then, of course, what roles does that play? Do politics play? The second question is, how does Marx's view of the progression of history compare to the Christian progressive views of the past? And then the third question is, how do historians take part in predicting the future, and is it proper for them to do so? Thank you.